Usually, when you hear about a bridge collapsing, there is this comforting expectation of, structural clarity.
Right, like a binary kind of thing.
Exactly. You assume you could just look at the engineering blueprints, watch the inspector point a flashlight at a rusted-out support beam,
Yeah.
and they simply say, there it is, that's the failure point.
Yeah.
It's just physics.
Yeah, it's entirely visible. I mean, it's either rusted or it's not. And that mathematical categorization offers us a sense of psychological safety. Like, we know what to fix for next time.
But when you step into the world of civilizational collapse, human sociology, macroeconomics, the way entire society will just sort of organically implode, suddenly that structural X-ray gets incredibly murky.
Oh, absolutely. Because the variables aren't just steel and concrete anymore.
Right. Because instead of looking at the rusted beam, the people standing on the collapsing bridge are, well, they're pointing up at the sky.
Okay.
They are demanding a laser light show or a miracle or a charismatic savior while the concrete is literally turning to dust beneath their feet.
Which is, I mean, that's the absolute definition of systemic evasion. And that exact human behavioral loop is really the foundational architecture of the source material we are dissecting today in this deep dive.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, we are taking a stack of analysis that utilizes an ancient text, specifically Surah Al-Qasas, verses 48 and 49, to essentially X-ray this evasion tactic.
But we really need to set the parameters right up front here.
Yes, definitely.
If you're tuning in expecting some sort of theological sermon or, a sentimental religious reading, you really need to adjust your expectations right now.
Yeah, totally wrong framing.
Right. We are looking at this strictly as a masterclass in civilizational survival and systems engineering. The author of the commentary we're analyzing approaches these verses purely as a sociological schematic.
Basically stripping away all the mysticism, right?
Exactly. The text looks at the mechanics of how human societies operate. It asks this really brutal question, like, how do societies either thrive by installing universal objective laws, or how do they inevitably collapse under the sheer weight of their own psychological defense mechanisms?
And the premise here really centers on the ultimate human defense mechanism. The text explores why failing systems, whether we're talking about a collapsing historical empire or a modern bankrupt nation-state, or honestly even a toxic corporate board, why they will suddenly demand flashy spectacles.
Yeah, and they do this specifically to avoid engaging with the actual operating manual that could save them from ruin.
Right. So to map this out, the source material begins by contextualizing this really famous historical struggle, one that, most people know as a Sunday school story, the confrontation between Moses or Musa and Pharaoh.
But the text aggressively reframes this. I mean, it does not present this as a story of magical plagues and wizards.
No, not at all.
It frames it as a systemic cycle of a ruling elite facing an inevitable economic and social crash.
According to the source's framework, there's this highly specific behavioral pattern that emerges right before a society hits the wall, like right before the destruction of their system becomes undeniable.
The populace starts complaining.
Exactly. The populace, and particularly the vested interests, they start with this preemptive excuse. The text notes they say, if only a messenger or a clear guide had come to us, we wouldn't have made these mistakes.
It's fascinating because they immediately construct a narrative of victimization based on, informational starvation.
Right, like we didn't know.
Yeah, they claim we are failing because we lacked the data. But the author points out that this is an intellectual trap because verse 28.48 introduces the critical pivot. The guidance actually arrives.
The data is literally handed to them.
Exactly. A comprehensive structural operating manual for a functional society is placed directly on their desks.
And what is the reaction? I mean, do they read the manual? No. The text quotes their immediate pivot. They say, why was he not given the like of what Musa was given?
The text just ruthlessly exposes the profound bad faith in that pivot. When presented with objective guidance, they immediately demand a spectacle.
They want the fireworks display.
Right. They want to see it apart. But the author highlights a glaring historical irony here. The text points out that these are the exact same systemic archetypes, the same demographic of vested interests who, according to the text, actively disbelieved in Musa's supposed miracle in the first place.
Wait, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, because if you are a citizen of a failing state, and someone claims to have the ultimate operational manual to fix your society, isn't it entirely rational to demand some sort of extraordinary proof? I mean, isn't demanding evidence just good science?
Well, if they were demanding evidence of the manual's efficacy, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. But the source argues they are not asking for evidentiary proof. They are asking for a spectacle.
And there's a big difference.
Huge difference. A spectacle demands absolutely nothing of the observer. If I show you a magic trick, you just watch it, you applaud, and you go home.
Right, you're just entertained.
But if I hand you an operating manual that dictates how wealth must be distributed, how justice must be applied equally, and how monopolies must be dismantled, well, that demands a complete restructuring of your reality.
Oh, I see. So it is a stalling tactic that sort of disguises intellectual rigor. It reminds me of, a failing corporation that's just bleeding millions of dollars.
Yeah.
The board brings in a turnaround consultant who drops a 500-page, painstakingly researched restructuring plan right on the table.
Yeah.
And instead of reading page 1, the CEO looks at the consultant and says, yeah, but can you double our stock price by Friday with a viral marketing stunt? The last guy couldn't do a magic trick either, so we're not going to read this.
Yeah.
They pre-commit to rejecting the structural fix.
Precisely. The source argues that the demand for a sign is the ultimate defense mechanism against accountability. Implementing objective laws means the ruling class has to surrender power, so they demand a spectacle, knowing full well that even if one were provided, they would just find a way to dismiss it anyway.
Right.
And the text provides a really fascinating linguistic breakdown of exactly how they formulate that dismissal.
Yeah, this is where the analysis gets deep into the mechanics of the evasion.
Right.
Because if you have two massive pieces of historical precedent staring you in the face, like the old system of Musa and the new system being presented, how do you dismiss both of them simultaneously without looking completely irrational?
Well, you link them together into a super conspiracy.
Naturally.
The source zeroes in on a very specific Arabic phrase used by the deniers in verse 28.48. It's Siran Tazahara. Now, conventionally, many commentators translate this literally as magic or sorcery.
Right, the wizard stuff.
Yeah, but the author parses this language through a strict socio-political lens. The phrase translates roughly to two works of magic backing each other up.
I want to stop on that word, Tazahara, because the conventional translation of magic implies people are literally afraid of wizards. But the source is taking this in a completely different direction.
Yes, the source removes the superstitious element entirely. Tazahara means to mutually reinforce, to support one another in a coordinated, systemic way.
Oh, wow.
By utilizing this exact terminology, the author demonstrates how the deniers are constructing a brilliant, albeit deeply cynical, conspiracy frame. They look at the old message, they look at the new message, they file both under the label of sorcery and declare, we reject all of it, it's a coordinated scam.
So by calling it a coordinated trick, they insulate themselves from ever having to address the actual contents of the message. If you're listening to this, think about how this applies to modern informational warfare. It is the exact equivalent of two independent, peer-reviewed scientific studies coming out, both proving that a major factory is dumping toxic chemicals into the local river.
Right. And instead of addressing the chemistry in the water, what does the factory owner do?
They don't hire their own chemist to refute the data. They go on television and say, these two universities are in on a coordinated hoax. It's a politically motivated conspiracy. Siran Tazahara. You don't have to change your factory filters. You don't have to engage with the data. You just label it a mutually reinforcing illusion, and you absolve yourself of the responsibility to think.
It is a deliberate choice to intellectually starve yourself to protect your vested interests. You dismiss the structural data as a systemic conspiracy. And what is so compelling about this source material is how it frames the counterattack to this evasion.
Yeah, this is brilliant.
Once the spectacle demand is exposed as a fraud, the text highlights the response in the very next verse, 28.49.
This response totally shifts the battlefield. The verse basically says, bring a book from God that guides better than these two, and I will follow it.
This is the engine of reason activating. The source argues that this is the cleanest, most rational dismantling of the spectacle demand possible. The burden of proof is entirely shifted back onto the people demanding the magic trick.
The text is effectively saying, fine, we were done talking about miracles and fireworks, produce a better operating manual. Like, if you think this socio-economic code is flawed, if you think this system of justice is unworkable, don't ask for a laser light show. Out-argue the guidance.
Exactly. It is a pure systems engineering challenge. The author points out that this reframes the entire contest. It moves from a demand for supernatural evidence to a contest of guidance content.
Which is much harder.
Way harder. If your system of exploiting labor, hoarding wealth, and maintaining class divides is superior, prove it structurally. Show us the blueprints for a society that thrives better under your rules than under the universal laws being presented.
And what is the historical result of that challenge, according to the text?
Complete silence.
Just crickets, right?
The text asserts that their inevitable inability to produce a superior, contradiction-free operating manual is the ultimate proof that the demand for science was never about evidence. It was an active, deliberate strategy to avoid the argument altogether.
Because pointing out flaws is incredibly easy. I mean, complaining is the lowest form of intellectual engagement. But writing a functional universal legal code that governs human behavior, balances macroeconomics, and administers justice without internal hypocrisies, that requires an actual understanding of universal laws.
Absolutely.
So if a civilization pre-commits to rejection, if they refuse this contest of guidance and just stick their fingers in their ears, what happens to them?
That leads to the core mechanism the source details. It's called mukafat-e-amal. This translates to the law of requital.
Now, I need to jump in here because when most people hear the phrase law of requital in a religious or ancient textual context, they immediately picture, divine retribution, a lightning bolt coming out of the clouds to smite a wicked city.
Exactly, and the author vehemently argues against that mythological interpretation. The source frames mukafat-e-amal entirely as a self-administered socio-political consequence. It is the natural law of cause and effect applied to the mechanics of a civilization.
So if you build a bridge with substandard, cheap concrete, and you ignore the structural engineer's manual, gravity is not punishing you when the bridge collapses.
No, gravity is entirely indifferent.
Right. The collapse is simply the inherent requital for ignoring the objective laws of physics.
That is the precise logic the source uses. By labeling all corrective evidence as a conspiracy, and by refusing to engage in the guidance contest, a society cuts itself off from the very code that could keep its system running.
They starve themselves.
Yeah, they get to stubbornly hold on to their positions of power, but the cost is total informational starvation.
They lose access to the blueprints required to stop the concrete from crumbling. And the source text doesn't just leave this as an abstract theory, right? It provides a massive historical case study to illustrate this law of requital in action. It focuses extensively on the historical narrative of the Jewish people.
Right. And here we must impartially report the specific historical claims and the systemic arguments presented by the author. The source uses this history not as a theological critique, but as a socio-economic blueprint of failure.
To show the mechanics.
Exactly. The text points to specific data points, like the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Roman general Titus in 70 AD, the subsequent expulsion of the population, and their transition into what the text refers to as the stateless archetype of the wandering Jew for nearly 2 millennia.
But the author does not attribute this civilizational collapse to a lack of military strength or some sort of unavoidable geopolitical bad luck. And it certainly doesn't frame it as a mystical curse.
No curses here.
Right. The text argues that this collapse happened because the internal socio-political engine was built on mechanics that fundamentally violated universal laws.
The author specifically targets their economic foundation. The text argues that they built their societal engine on usury and interest, alongside intense political manipulation and the preservation of vested clerical interests. The source claims this pattern persisted even later in history, in places like Medina and Khaybar.
Let's break down the how of that argument. Like, how does usury, the charging of interest, actually rot a civilizational engine according to this framework?
Well, from a systems perspective, usury is an artificial wealth concentration mechanism. When an economy relies on interest rather than the actual production and equitable distribution of resources, wealth inevitably funnels upward into the hands of a very small elite.
Making the rich richer without creating real value.
Right, and this freezes social mobility. It creates a vast, disenfranchised underclass burdened by insurmountable debt.
So the structural integrity of the society is compromised from the inside out.
Exactly. When the majority of your populace is economically starved to feed the vested interests at the top, the society loses its cohesion. It cannot mount a unified defense against external threats like the Roman Empire, because the internal contract between the citizen and the system has already been broken.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
The author is using this as the prime example of mukafat-e-amal. When you reject the better book, the universal operating manual that bans exploitative economics, You are left running a flawed code, and mathematical certainty dictates that the system will eventually crash.
Okay, so we have deeply examined the X-ray of a failing system. We see the preemptive excuses, the demand for flashy spectacles, the intellectual starvation, the economic exploitation, and the inevitable collapse. But if we follow the source's logic, what does a society look like when it actually installs the proper operating manual?
Does it work?
Yeah. Does the author offer a real-world proof of concept, or is this all just utopian theory?
The source absolutely offers a proof of concept. It contrasts the previous systemic failures with the historical Islamic State, specifically honing in on the era of Hazrat Umar. And what is vital here is that the author does not rely on grand philosophical treatises to make this point.
Right, it's not just abstract poetry.
No, the text provides highly specific physical data points to demonstrate what a stable universal system looks like when the code is executed properly.
And these anecdotes from the text are striking because they focus on the micro-interactions. If you are an engineer, you know that the macro system is only as good as its smallest component.
Exactly.
To prove the society was functioning, the text looks at the protection of zimmis. For those listening, the text defines a zimmi as a non-Muslim minority citizen living within the state who pays a specific tax in exchange for absolute state protection and exemption from military service.
The first data point the author shares involves a highly powerful figure, the governor of Egypt during Umar's era. According to the text, this governor was summoned all the way from Egypt to the central governing authority in Medina. He was called to answer for a very specific crime against a zimmi.
And what was the crime? I mean, it wasn't physical violence. It wasn't extortion or property theft. The text notes that the governor simply said to the zimmi, "May God disgrace you." That is it, a verbal insult.
Just words. And the consequence for that verbal insult. The text states that the governor was forced to resign. He was stripped of his executive power.
If we look at this through the lens of systems engineering, this is mind-blowing. The central authority determined that an administrator who could not handle the responsibility of protecting the dignity of a minority citizen was fundamentally incompatible with the operating system.
It is the ultimate service-level agreement, an SLA, between a state and its citizens. In a corrupt system, the kind that relies on evasion and spectacle, the governor's power and political connections would protect him.
Oh, 100%.
But under universal law, the code executes blindly. The system has zero tolerance for a breach of contract by its own administrators.
There's a second anecdote the source shares about Hazrat Umar that perfectly illustrates this SLA loop. Umar is walking one day and encounters an old Jewish man. The man is on his way to pay his state taxes.
Okay.
Umar stops him, inquires about his living situation, and realizes a critical failure. The state has not actually provided any material benefits, pensions, or social safety net to this elderly citizen yet.
So what does the head of the state do? According to the source, Umar immediately stops the tax collection. He dictates that the state has absolutely no right to extract taxes from a citizen if it has not first fulfilled its prerequisite duty of providing for the welfare of that citizen.
Taxation without state provision is fundamentally invalid. It is a flawless, logical loop.
It really is.
The source uses this to prove a massive systemic point. The system worked incredibly well because it relied on objective law. It wasn't based on emotional sentimentality, and it certainly wasn't based on sectarian bias. The law was the law, regardless of who was enforcing it or who was subject to it.
But this raises an incredibly uncomfortable question, and it is one the source tackles head-on. If the original operating manual was so unequivocally clear, and if the system ran so perfectly during that era.
What went wrong?
Right. If the code was bug-free, how did the civilizational engine eventually stall out and crash?
In computer architecture terms, how do you crash a perfectly functioning motherboard?
You introduce competing, contradictory lines of code. And this is where the source text makes one of its most fascinating and, frankly, explosive arguments. It completely redefines a major theological concept to explain the systemic failure. The author redefines the concept of shirk.
If you are familiar with the terminology, conventionally, shirk is translated almost exclusively as polytheism. It conjures images of people bowing down to multiple statues, worshiping idols of stone or wood. It is viewed as a purely spiritual, personal sin.
But the source material aggressively critiques this privatized, purely spiritual reading. The text utilizes verses like 23.5253 and 42.13 to construct a radically different framework.
Okay, what's the framework?
The author argues that in a socio-political context, shirk actually means establishing multiple competing legal authorities within a single system.
Wow. I want to make sure we clearly differentiate the terminology here, because the source draws a hard line between deen and mazhab.
That distinction is paramount to the author's argument. The text defines deen as a unified, constitutional system of statecraft and socio-economic law. It is the singular operating manual for the society.
And mazhab.
Mazhab, on the other hand, is defined by the source as privatized religion, personal dogma, and ritualistic sects.
So let's adapt the author's redefinition of shirk to a modern analogy. Imagine a nation-state trying to operate as a unified deen. But instead of one federal constitution, every single neighborhood decides to answer to a completely different legal code.
Yes. The street on the left follows the federal law. The street on the right says, no, we have our own sovereign legal framework. The neighborhood in the north claims they answer only to a specific clerical council.
If you build a ship where the engine room is taking orders from Captain A, the navigation deck is taking orders from Captain B, and the rudder is controlled by Captain C, that ship is going to tear itself apart the moment it hits rough waters. It is an impossible architecture.
And the source applies this exact architectural logic to the historical development of sectarianism. The text provides a scathing critique of fiqh, which is the historical body of Islamic jurisprudence. The author points out that over centuries, society developed all these different parallel schools of jurisprudence. Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, Jafari, Ali Hadith.
And all of them are operating simultaneously, yet all of them claim to be following the one unified deen.
According to the source, this is the core structural failure. Having all these different contradictory legal codes operating at the same time is an act of rebellion against the unified state.
So it's systemic treason, basically.
In a way, yeah. The text argues that sectarianism is the socio-political equivalent of polytheism. You are setting up rival gods, meaning rival lawmakers and rival constitutional authorities, within a system that demands a single, universal operating code.
It goes back to the motherboard analogy. If you feed 5 conflicting operating systems into one computer, telling the hardware to execute contradictory commands simultaneously, the system fundamentally crashes.
It has to.
The text argues that sectarianism is not just a polite difference of scholarly opinion. It is a critical structural vulnerability that destroys the unified authority of the original manual.
But to understand how a civilization allowed this to happen, the text explores the mechanism of vulnerability. Like, how did these competing codes get installed in the first place? Who uploaded the malware?
To explain this, the author explores verse 22.52. The verse discusses how Satan attempts to mix falsehood into the clear message. But again, just like with the redefinition of shirk, the source strips away the mythological, supernatural reading.
Exactly. In this framework, Satan is not a literal demon with horns whispering in people's ears. The text defines Satan sociologically.
As vested interests.
Yes. It represents rebellious human elements, vested interests, the wealthy elite, and political opportunists who intentionally introduce bugs into the constitutional code. And they do this to regain the power they lost when the universal laws were implemented.
And the source provides a highly specific and very controversial historical timeline for how this interpolation occurred. We need to look impartially at the text's historical analysis here because it makes a massive claim.
It really does.
The author argues that for the first 250 years, the Quran served as the sole constitution. It was the singular, unadulterated operating manual. But then, a massive systemic shift occurred.
According to the text, a movement began where compilers, and the author specifically points out that these were primarily from outside the Arab world, such as regions in Persia, they began gathering what is known as hadith, or sayings attributed to the prophet.
Right.
And the source highlights a staggering statistical claim regarding this process, focusing on Imam Bukhari, one of the most famous historical compilers.
Let me guess, the numbers don't add up from a systems perspective.
Not at all. The text notes that Imam Bukhari allegedly sifted through 600,000 different sayings to select just a few thousand, which were then positioned alongside, or in some cases even above, the original Quranic constitution.
Let's pause on that number, 600,000. I mean, I have to push back on the author's cynicism here. Traditionalists would argue that there was a highly rigorous, almost mathematical chain of narration, the isnad, used to verify these sayings. They didn't just pick them at random. There was an entire science dedicated to authenticating who said what. Does the source just dismiss the entire science of hadith verification out of hand?
Well, the source approaches it not by debating the isnad itself, but by looking at the systemic result. The author's argument is that no matter how rigorous you claim the chain of transmission is, trying to legally verify 600,000 verbal quotes passed down through a 250-year game of telephone is inherently vulnerable to human corruption.
So it's an attack on the medium itself.
Yes. The source argues that this massive volume of unwritten oral tradition opened the floodgates. It provided the perfect camouflage for vested interests to interpolate their own agendas, their own Persian or Byzantine cultural norms, and their own competing codes into the system under the guise of sacred historical tradition.
And once you introduce thousands of new external laws into a singular constitution, you are inevitably going to create massive contradictions.
Yeah.
The new code is going to clash with the original manual. So how did the historical scholars fix the bugs they introduced?
They introduced another concept, which the source attacks relentlessly, the mechanism of NASC, or abrogation.
Oh, the abrogation fallacy. The text critique of this is absolutely scathing.
It is the author's prime example of a civilization destroying its own engine of reason. NASC is a theological doctrine developed by later scholars which claims that certain verses within the Quran itself were abrogated.
Meaning they were literally canceled out, deleted, or rendered legally void in order to resolve contradictions within newly compiled external Hadith traditions.
Exactly.
If you are listening to this, think about how absurd that is from a purely legal or engineering perspective. The text mocks this idea without mercy. The author points out the historical inconsistency of this doctrine. Over the centuries, the number of supposedly abrogated or deleted verses kept wildly changing.
Yeah, originally, some historical scholars claim that up to 500 verses of the Constitution were legally canceled. Later, figures like Shah Waliullah reduced that number to just 5.
The text points out the utter absurdity of humans claiming that the divine perfect operating manual, the very book they claim is the ultimate universal law, is actually full of deleted, invalid code. And conveniently, it is the clergy and the scholars who get to decide which laws are deleted and which ones are kept.
And that is the exact mechanism of the power shift. The author argues that NASC is how you destroy a civilization's cognitive engine. You convince the populace that the original perfect operating manual is actually incredibly confusing, filled with contradictions, and requires thousands of external, unverified patches to function.
And who controls the patches?
The vested interests. The clergy. The political elite. Once you convince people that the Constitution is essentially broken without their external commentary, objective law is dead. The power transfers entirely from the written, immutable Constitution to the people who hold the keys to the abrogated interpretations.
Which brings us to the ultimate proof of the source's thesis. Because if a civilization's underlying code is this fragmented, if its engine is running on 5 conflicting operating systems patched together by centuries of vested interests, we shouldn't just be reading about philosophical debates in dusty libraries. We should see the physical symptoms of a crash system out in the real world today.
Exactly. When a ship's engine is destroying itself, you feel the vibrations on the deck. The source provides modern physical examples to prove that the system has fragmented into incompatible parts. The author focuses on the most basic, daily, unifying action of the civilization, the act of prayer.
The logic here is brutal. If a society cannot even unify on the physical mechanics of standing in a line and praying together, it has absolutely zero hope of unifying on infinitely more complex issues like macroeconomics, international statecraft, or criminal justice.
The anecdotes the text uses to illustrate this systemic crash are almost tragicomical. The first example involves the PNA, the Pakistan National Alliance. This was a massive, highly publicized political coalition formed by various religious and political leaders.
The text describes how these leaders, representing different sects, united for a grand political spectacle. They organized a massive event where they all sat down to break their fast together at the same table. It was a beautiful, orchestrated picture of unity for the cameras and the press.
But then what happened when the sun actually went down?
When it came time to actually perform the physical act of prayer, the underlying systemic fragmentation asserted itself. The system crashed in real time. The text notes that the Deobandi leaders and the Barelvi leaders, who, by the way, both claim to be from the exact same broader sect, Sunni Hanafi, could not pray together.
Wow.
They physically separated. They went to different corners of the very same lawn to pray in separate, isolated groups.
Why? Because their underlying codes, their specific mazhabs, their interpolated rules were fundamentally incompatible. They could eat together for a political photo op, but they couldn't execute a basic synchronized physical movement because they no longer followed the same manual.
The spectacle of unity was there for the dinner, but the actual guidance, the operational reality of their system was completely fractured. And the text offers another glaring high-profile example, the Data Darbar incident in Lahore.
Yes. The Imam of the Kaaba, who is arguably the most prominent, universally recognized prayer leader in the Islamic world, visited Lahore. Symbolically, you would assume this would be a massive unifying moment for the entire population.
Right, like a stadium event.
But the text details the reality of the crashed system. While a portion of the population eagerly gathered to pray behind him, another massive segment of the population absolutely refused.
Quest flat out refused.
Refused. The refusing group publicly declared that his specific practices and his theological views regarding their local shrine practices rendered his leadership completely invalid.
The author uses these incidents to hammer home the central thesis. These are not minor, polite disagreements over aesthetic rituals. In the framework of the source text, these are system-critical failures.
Absolutely.
It proves that when you replace the singular objective operating manual with 1,000 competing codes of sectarian jurisprudence, the unified system dies.
The body might still be twitching, but the civilizational engine has stalled out. The mukafat-e-amal, the law of requital, has taken effect. They chose the spectacle over the guidance, they interpolated the code, and now they are completely paralyzed by their own internal fragmentation.
So let's pull all of this together and bring this entire analytical journey full circle. We're going to go right back to where we started, Surah Al-Qasas, verses 48 and 49.
It is incredible how much architecture the author extracted from those two verses.
Yeah, we have gone from an ancient socio-economic conflict between Moses and Pharaoh, analyzed the collapse of empires due to usury, unpacked the linguistic trickery of dodging accountability, dissected the legal compilation of history, and ended up watching modern politicians refuse to stand on the same lawn.
What ties every single one of those elements together is the permanence of the human evasion tactic. The author argues that those two verses perfectly permanently x-ray the difference between a society that genuinely wants evidence to improve and a society that just wants an exit strategy to protect its elite.
The demand for a spectacle is the signature. It is the tell. When a leader, a board, or a populace demands a miracle instead of a structural plan, they have already decided to reject the truth.
And while that core psychological principle remains permanent, the text makes a vital observation about the evolution of the evasion itself. The mechanism stays the same, but the vocabulary updates. Yesterday's excuse was Siran Tazahara, labeling two perfectly valid sources of historical and systemic guidance as a coordinated, mutually reinforcing magic trick.
And today, if you were listening to this, you hear this exact evasion every single day. Today's label is propaganda. It's fake news. It's dismissing hard, structural, peer-reviewed data as a politically motivated conspiracy theory.
Exactly. The labels for dismissal evolve across eras, from magic to misinformation, but the human evasion is absolutely identical.
The ultimate synthesis of the source material is this. The honest test of a worldview or an economic system or a political structure isn't the fireworks it can produce in the sky. It isn't the charisma of its leaders or the grandeur of its spectacles.
The only valid test is the guidance content. It is the quality, the stability, the equity, and the universality of the order it can build on the ground.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought, and this is specifically for you listening right now. Step away from the massive historical case studies for a second and look at the microsystems in your own life. Look at the failing systems you interact with. Maybe it's the corporate structure where you work, a political organization you volunteer for, or even a toxic social dynamic in your community.
When things start crumbling, when the concrete of those systems starts to dust, look at the behavior of the people in charge.
What specific miracles or spectacles are we demanding from our leaders today? Are we begging for a charismatic CEO, a viral marketing campaign, or a populist politician to perform a magic trick?
And more importantly, are we demanding those spectacles purely as a psychological excuse to avoid implementing the difficult foundational guidance, the real, painful restructuring that is already sitting right in front of us?
Are we actually asking the structural inspector to help us fix the bridge, or are we just asking for a better, more distracting light show as we fall into the river? That is the ultimate question of civilizational survival. We'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.